All right, let's begin. Hi, everyone. I'm Siobhan. I'll be your host today, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Float, joined by Jacquie Ford and Justin Watt. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling from the traditional land of the Wangal people, and Jacquie is on the Cammeraygal land, both First Nations tribes of the Eora Nation. I pay my deepest respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Justin is joining us from Vancouver in Canada, and he is based on the traditional land of the Squamish and Musqueam people. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations communities where he is based today and extend my deepest respects to any First Nations people who might be joining us on this call. Okay, we have 30 minutes with these two fine folks to hear their practical tips and hot takes. A bit of housekeeping for those joining us today. We don't have any bathrooms. There won't be an intermission. However, if you check the chat, I've just dropped a live question link where we've had folks send in some questions before this session with their upvotes, and we welcome you to add to this throughout the call as well. We'll try and get to these at the end, and if we don't have time, we'll take it as feedback for maybe a future one. All right. So we are all here today because we've agreed that we need to talk about capacity. So let's kick off with a gentle rant. Jacquie and Justin, you both have extensive experience at organizations of various sizes, but in particular, 100 plus people, teams within companies. Can you share with us a quick example of the biggest challenges that you've encountered for juggling capacity in teams of this size? Justin, perhaps you could go first.
Sure. I would say as a team grows, there's more cooks in the kitchen, and one of the hardest things to balance is everyone talking the same language, so to speak. So it might sound super simple, but just nomenclature of titles and what those titles mean for, folks who are in agency land, of course, if they're estimating work, and then there's teams that are doing the work and the resourcing team kind of in the middle. If everyone's using different language or different terms for referring maybe to different things or the same thing, that can be one of the hardest things to scale. So it sounds simple and overly semantic, but just having the right words that we're all using. Jacquie, I'm curious about you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the most obvious one for me is probably just really trying to work out the most fair prioritization framework. So, often we're dealing with teams that have different KPIs, different objectives they're trying to meet, and trying to work out the most even-keeled way of prioritizing what is the most urgent and important and impactful work can be really tricky to navigate. So I'd say, working on that prioritization piece and navigating, negotiating is probably the trickiest part there.
Thank you both. I'm actually curious because you both have experience in-house and at agencies in creative ops roles and in leadership roles as well. Are there any differences between the two when managing capacity across these organizations? Jacquie, perhaps you can share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious thing here is that it's much harder to negotiate when you're dealing with clients and their money. So it is tricky, a trickier conversation to have versus when you're working in house and you can sort of use the obvious levers of business impact and I guess urgency to try and navigate those conversations and make decisions as a team. It's much harder to do that when you're dealing with clients who are, obviously and often up against deadlines as well. What do you think, Justin?
I would say negotiation is definitely part of it. In-house, you just have more kind of flexibility, so to speak. So there's kind of more understanding. Whereas, especially for folks in agency land when they're resourcing, there's a lot more pressure coming from usually a sales team. And usually there's a swath of things that they all want to get started and everyone's priorities are the highest. And there's only so many bums in seats, so to speak. And these are humans at the end of the day. So I think the most challenging thing is balancing the human needs with the business needs.
Nice one, thank you. It's interesting the theme of negotiation coming up still between both, and then remembering that it is people doing the work, the human element. Something that we've observed is that when there isn't a dedicated creative ops or resource planning point person, managing capacity is kind of all over the place. So, Justin, I know that this is your jam. Could you walk us through how you work with teams and your clients on these types of challenges?
Sure. You had brought this up as a topic, so I put together just kind of instead of me rambling on, a bit of a visual for just a couple quick slides to kind of walk through how I at least approach resourcing. Classic Zoom question. Can you see my screen? Thumbs up. Okay. So I was thinking about this, and I think the common belief is, from resourcing land, I'm sure many here have been in the trenches and know this isn't reality, but I think a lot of people start with the assumption that, everyone's here for 40 hours a week, so let's resource them against that. And I think the reality is how much billable capacity, especially when you're talking about agency land, billable capacity is always a term thrown around. It might just be capacity, if there's not billings against it, that's understandable too. But at the end of the day, you're really trying to figure out how much billable capacity everyone has because everyone's weeks are not the same. So I was thinking about, some quick examples of you might have a team that is a design team and a copywriting, marketing team with a PM attached to it. And a lot of times, someone might be pulled in a different direction. A design lead might not actually have the capacity for 40 hours a week. And so just baking that into your assumptions and baking that into kind of how you're planning ahead. And these might seem like overly simple examples, but it might be a different design team that everyone is thinking for marketing piece of work too. And it could be these two teams up against each other that you're picking from resourcing wise, but obviously they're very different because someone's capacity is put elsewhere. And so when you look at these two combined or side by side, your monthly capacity is very different. So just knowing the baseline of capacity. Now, the challenge, of course, I think, is when you start to scale that. And to keep it simple, I think, thinking about agency land especially, but in general, whether you're working with a product team or an engineering team or an agency, there's, each project being estimated. And so just taking this to keep it simple of, that estimated allocation, let's say it's that team we were just talking about, and that need is 480 hours a month. And then let's add in 2 more projects and just make the same assumptions. And so even just with 3 teams, you're looking at 1,440 hours of capacity to really get nerdy with the numbers here for a sec. But if we think back to the last slide, there's team 1, which they don't have that full 40 hours a week. And then team 2 maybe did have that full 40 hours a week. And so right there, just those 2 teams scaled over 3 projects, you're already coming up, 200 hours short. And I think that's why a lot of agencies, especially, but in general, teams working in resourcing, capacity, operations, HR, even sometimes really feel that pressure where, we've got teams, but they're actually not able to fulfill the work. And then there's that pressure to either deliver more with less people or on the business side, add more people, and that can affect the business side. So just looking at kind of the reality of capacity, I always try to ask a few questions to stay on top of capacity. One is, what is my true capacity? Looking at all the roles and saying, how many hours do they all have per month? And then, of course, there's always the fun stuff in the background of, training and sick leave and parental leave and vacations and vacations and vacations that I think a lot of people feel in resourcing, trying to keep track of capacity. So being able to factor all this in and then just kind of distilling it down to a single number is always really useful to do. A lot of people talk about utilization rate. So, taking your total utilized time or time that people are booked to things divided by your total capacity just tells you kind of at a snapshot level how busy teams are. And then I think especially in agency land, the question to always ask is, of that utilized time, how much is billable or revenue generating? Because those two numbers are not always the same. You might have a team that is spread across different things and not all of that time is billable. So even just, again, taking this quick example here, they might be working a certain amount, but not all of that time might not be billable. So I'll stop rambling. Hopefully that those visuals helped out a bit, but that's how I think about resourcing.
I was going to unmute myself. It does. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to put that together as well. Jacquie, I'm curious to hear, like, if they're the same kind of questions you ask when you're trying to explain capacity to people in your organization or clients that you work with. Is that the kind of language that you use as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about available hours, utilization, billable hours. Absolutely. I think the other thing is we are moving to a model where there are a lot more people working odd hours or, self-imposed hours, or in a situation where I'm in at the moment where we have a story points allocation. So it's not necessarily the same person that's going to be working on your task at any given time, but we're sharing capacity across multiple teams. And so being able to plan around the capacity that our particular group has been allocated, there's need for flexibility there, but it all comes down to available hours and what is that true sense of available hours and figuring that out. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. I also love how you showed, Justin, like just because a team might have the same roles in it, it's still individual people. So that doesn't mean that they actually have the same capacity. And so I think really ensuring that you capture those nuances is really important. Um, Now I know that a lot of teams do this in a spreadsheet, and I know that's something that, Justin, you also are a bit of a spreadsheet whiz. Could you perhaps show us what you explained to us before, what that can look like in a spreadsheet?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say whiz because this is a monstrosity, some might say, but over the time have kind of used a spreadsheet approach to start out resourcing. Some teams keep it all in their heads, some teams keep it in a spreadsheet, some teams are using pen and paper, and then there's tools like Float on the market. But from a pure spreadsheet point of view, something that can be really useful is to be able to keep track of what are your projects, what are the teammates. You might see here as a quick example, there's multiple people, and this is so that over time you can show them across projects. If we take Lee for example here, and I'll explain these in a moment why these are useful. Oops, sorry. These other columns, but if Lee 1 week is on this project, next week he's on vacation, again keeping track of all of the nuance of capacity is useful, to be able to see are they actually available, and if they're not, is that billable or not. And then he might come back to this project for a couple of weeks and move on to another. And I won't ramble on about this, but point being, being able to keep track of, I prefer at a weekly level. I find a lot of places will track at an hourly level even, but often days. And that's, up to each organization how granular they want to get. I think at a certain point of size, it becomes kind of silly to be tracking at too granular of a level because you spend more time administrating than actually doing. And so in this case, being able to keep track of if people are billable or not and what department they're in, this all becomes very useful to start to track capacity long term and to forecast so that you can plan ahead as a resourcing individual or as a team. And so you'll see down here, all of this is taken into this. This is where the word monstrosity might come into play because there's a lot of formula magic going on here. But what this is doing is grabbing each role. So that's why we, say what the position they're in and what department they're in. So then we can start to plan ahead and see across all of these roles, what is their capacity or what is our capacity as a company? And then that individual person, what are they working? So then you can start to see if someone, is coming in and saying, we need a lot of mobile developers soon. You can see that, well, they're free for a little bit and then they become very busy and then free again. Or, design, you can see here as the numbers go down when people start to become free. And then chargeability is really just taking that same thing and modifying the formula to show essentially how much of that time is billable or not. So that's why, adding this billable tag in here is useful because then you can keep track. So this is a bit of a monster of a spreadsheet, but just an example of, how you can do it kind of rough and quick in spreadsheets, but still give yourself enough to be able to plan ahead.
Yeah, awesome. Actually, I'll ask you to please bring that spreadsheet up again, because I do just want to make sure that I'm reading some of it correctly and that our audience can follow as well. Because I think spreadsheets are familiar to most of us in the room, but especially for capacity management. And what I also love about this is everyone has their own way of structuring it. And I can see that this makes sense to me. So I can see that it works, but there's also things that I'm like, how does that work? So if you just bear with me, I want to ask. So say, for example, if we look at Lee, I can see Lee is working on 3 projects. So from each row is a new project. And then I'm reading it that 2 of Lee's projects are billable and 1 isn't. Is that correct?
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And then can we jump to the utilization tab? Because this really piqued my interest. Because what I observed here is that you're calculating utilization rates not based on total available hours, but actually based on their total billable hours. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think a lot of teams try to just start with a 40-hour work week, and I've seen a lot of success with just making a baseline assumption of how many hours to take out a week that are never probably going to be billable between training, breaks, time away, all that stuff. I see a lot of teams run a bit more level-headed when they just take a few hours out of every week's assumption. So everyone might still have a 40-hour work week, but assuming as a business around 37 and a half allows everyone to get on the same page easier.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And then the other thing that got me curious here is because I can see you've got it by week. So if I'm reading this right, the assumption is 37 and a half billable hours is available across product designer, UX, like these 6 roles in the org. So this is in some ways actually standardizing the amount of billable hours available for everyone, rather than looking at it at an individual level.
Yeah, exactly. And you can break it out at an individual level, but that's the point where I suggest starting to get out of a spreadsheet, because then it just becomes quite unmanageable.
Yeah, got it. Amazing. Jacquie, I'm interested to hear from you. Like, is this what your spreadsheets look like? What are some of your thoughts around this?
I was about to say Justin's monstrosity would be like my Taj Mahal. So I think you are a wizard. Just quietly. Mine do not look that sexy at all. But I guess the basis of them is the same. So yeah, I mean, putting in the available hours and capacity. And, you know, I do often get questioned on, why are you not putting 40 hours in? I mean, most of our workers will work more than 40 hours. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't you don't want to plan for that. You want to be a little bit more conservative. There's always, you know, buffer time, things that go wrong, you know, regressions, things like that. So, you know, I definitely would reinforce the need to be a bit more conservative with those allocations, and definitely get down to the individual capacity where you can. And yeah, totally agree that once you start getting to that, that need to manage at that level, spreadsheets are fantastic for doing what they do best, but they're not scalable in the same, you know, when you start talking about those bigger size teams, particularly if you're looking for accuracy and, you know, I guess reliability.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Justin, I think we've voted, and you do have some spreadsheet superpowers that we've agreed to acknowledge here. So I'm really curious to understand, like, both of you have mentioned that at some point the spreadsheet becomes unmanageable. And so it sounds like that's also a point where you want to be tracking capacity at an individual level. So Justin, I'm curious to hear from you, like, when is that point and what can that look like? And I will have a spoiler alert that I know that you've set this up to show what it looks like in Float. So I'll ask you to please share your screen again and walk us through that.
Yeah, I became a fan of Float long before our discussions here. And I say that because Float really helps, as many do. So not to just single out Float, like I'm a fan, and obviously we're here chatting with you, but in general, any tool that allows you to start to break down people's capacity at an individual level, I just love. And then being able to do little things like obviously pulling in holiday requests and having that map to people's actual, you know, HR requested or manager requested time off. A big thing too is being able to differentiate between, you know, locked in resourcing and planned or tentative or plan scenarios. And so this all becomes very useful when you can, you know, at an individual level, be able to see what their capacity is. Not everyone is the same, or if they're out, how that affects it. And then the useful thing off the back of that is you can kind of ladder that up to each project and plan. And then whatever tool you're using, but I'm a fan of Floats, which is, you know, being able to do reporting too automatically. So if you go make a bunch of updates on your schedule, what I'm really getting at is where a spreadsheet could technically do it, but why bother? That's when you get to this point of kind of individual capacity, factoring in time that away that's not billable, you know, tentative projects versus locked in projects, all that fun stuff. I always try to look for, you know, any tool that is not a spreadsheet to help out with that.
Yeah. And you've mentioned that a couple of times, like when you reach that point. What is that point? Like, what's that trigger point for you, Justin?
Think if you are trying to resource beyond the project level, so if you're being asked to resource like within a project, milestones or phases or story points, maybe whatever it might be, I think that's a good opportunity to do it. And then just inherently, I think size. Like I've seen teams as small as, you know, 15 or 20 use a tool like Float or others in the market, and I've seen teams start with a tool like Float at like 100. But I really think it comes down to your team and how granular you want to get day to day and your reporting. But I'm curious what Jacquie thinks too, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've had to maintain spreadsheets for teams, you know, around the 60 people mark, and that for me is really difficult to maintain with any, you know, confidence of accuracy or consistency. So I would say probably the threshold on size for me would be around the 30 mark. That's when I'd be looking to start to use a tool that's going to automate a lot of that for me.
Got it. Thank you both. So of course, I love seeing concepts like this explained in Float, but I'm not here to sell. So let's real talk. Justin, I know that you've used Float for a long time and that you're very familiar with us, but you've also been in situations where you've had to drop us when leadership wanted to move to an ERP, they wanted to centralize the financial component and the project management side. And so I'm really interested to hear the trade-offs of that. Like, we know that the spreadsheet can work up to a point. We know that if you want to be managing capacity at an individual level, a tool like Float is much better. And then we have the heavy hitters like the cantatas and the smart sheets that do a bit more. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on the trade-offs of those tools. And for the creative ops folks in the room, what should be some of their non-negotiables when they're going through this evaluation process for planning capacity?
I think the biggest thing is if you hear whiffs of an ERP needing to be adopted, get in there as quick as you can from a resourcing or operations perspective to provide your input. Because I have noticed, well, maybe I'll back up. Before kind of moving into operations and resourcing, all that fun stuff, I worked at IBM years ago, where the red tape had red tape when it came to resourcing, and that was because the ERP had so much technical and customization limitations that all the process was built around the limitations of the software. And so teams would go then around the software and start creating their own spreadsheets. And then I've seen that play out in other teams too, where they try to find an ERP that does everything, and then no one uses it because resourcing wants to work over here in spreadsheets. PMs are secretly working in Asana or ClickUp or whatever it might be for their day-to-day project management, and everyone starts to abandon it. And then what is the point anyways? So that's one big part. And then the other part is, can it plug into other tools? Like a reason I'm a fan of Float, for example, is because there is an API. And so if you are forced off of your way of doing things, then making sure that it can plug into other tools, because if over time that ERP isn't working for certain parts, at least you can connect it to the right tools in your organization. But I'm rambling now. Jacquie, I'm curious your take.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think the real thing for me is the tool is only going to be valuable if everyone's using it in the right way and in a consistent way. And often there are some tools that day to day people just start to move away from, either because they're too complex, they're not easy on the eye in terms of usability, they're clunky and they take a while, or it feels like a real administrative part of your day that you always put to the end of the day. And then when that starts to happen, to your point, Justin, people will start to use other tools that are easier for them to manage and maintain and make assumptions around. So yeah, I mean, the non-negotiables for me would be the data has to give you the right intel to make the right business decisions quickly and easily with the right people in the room. And so when it comes to thinking through what that looks like for an ERP, for example, I think they're the questions you need to really ask around, is this going to give me the ability to do that or not?
Got it. I actually love that point about data, especially for driving decision making. And it's something that we at Float feel really bullish about, that we believe your resource management tool should be the most accurate place for your people and project data. So I'm interested to hear a bit more about your view on that, Jacquie. Where does data fit in capacity planning, capacity management, and more broadly, resource management?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, and we sort of talked about this yesterday, but the resource planner or manager shouldn't necessarily be the one making the decisions. You need to be using data to help build out the various different scenarios, to help the business partners help make decisions for you. What is going to be the most important solution? What is going to be the most important outcome? Use the data, particularly around, modeling, scenario modeling, use that data to help drive decisions about, well, are we going to invest in getting more people in to get this job done faster? Here's what that's going to look like. Or are we going to continue with the capacity that we have and know that it's going to take a little bit longer? So I think it's really just arming your partners that are helping to make those decisions with the right information, to feel confident about those decisions, and taking yourself out of that process and being a lot more pragmatic about it. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I think to that end, like I was told by a wonderful boss I had a few years ago that resourcing should be Switzerland. And so to that end, using data not as a offensive mechanism to get what you want, but as a, let's all get on the same page and look at the data, and resourcing is there to present that to everyone so that they can help make a decision. Data is not meant to kind of sprinkle over here or over there based on who needs to know what. So point being, if your goal is to be Switzerland, then you need as much data as you can, because people will start to look to you for the answers. And so if that side of house is not together, then people will try to figure it out on their own, and that's when things tend to fall apart resourcing wise.
I love that, especially using data for negotiation, but as you say, like kind of presenting the facts so people can arrive at those decisions themselves. I'm conscious of time. We've only got 5 minutes left, and there were a couple of audience questions that we wanted to cover. So I'm going to quickly bring them up on my screen, and I've dropped them into the chat. Jacquie, did you have any insights or advice you could share on these questions that we've received? So the first one is around playing politics, around allocations. And the second is, what are the types of questions that folks can ask when to make better decisions with resource allocation?
Yeah, I'll be really quick and high level on this one. But for the first part of the question, I think there's sort of three main things that I'd be looking at. I'd be looking at what prioritization framework you have in place and getting all of your product managers on board with the prioritization framework that is going to work for everyone. So it might be RICE or ICE or, whatever that looks like for your business. I think modeling out those different scenarios to show versus tell is a really good tool to have in your back pocket and help your product managers make those decisions collectively. And then the other tactic that might work is locking to a fixed sprint schedule. So locking down the time frame where you're planning what work is going to go in, so that you're avoiding any context switching in the middle of a sprint where you're pulling someone off a task midway through that they're going to have to pick up later because somebody's had, something super urgent come through. If you locked down a sprint schedule, it just means that there's no opportunity to sort of flex on what it is you've agreed to do or get done in a fixed period of time. And then in terms of what questions to ask to make people better decisions around assigning people, we talked about this at the top of the call, that there are humans at the end of the day doing all of the work. And so I think one superpower, that a resource manager can employ is really understanding who the individuals are, working with their managers to figure out what are some of the opportunities that that person wants to gain, or what are some of the skills that they want to sort of push into, and not just give people the same type of task just because they're good at them. So I think that's sort of a question that we often forget to ask in the throes of wanting to get stuff shipped really quickly and efficiently.
Got it. Thank you, Justin. Any final thoughts to add around playing the politics of capacity management and resource allocation? A couple of questions that folks can keep in their back pocket.
Yeah, I think to respect everyone's time that they have to go, I think to answer both questions with one is really asking first as many quantitative questions as possible to remove the emotion. And someone in that question put politics, but for lack of a better word, to remove the emotion from it is just asking, what allocation do you need? What's the start date? What's the end date? What are the needs? And then letting the emotional part and qualitative questions, so to speak, come into play. But I think you can remove a lot of frustration by just starting with the quantitative and getting those out of the way and everyone on the same page.
I love that link of quantitative and then the importance of capturing data. That all makes a lot of sense. Well, we are on time, and I feel like we absolutely breezed through that. We covered so many things. So thank you, Justin and Jacquie, so much for your time today. I do want to offer folks the opportunity to keep in touch with you both. So you're both discoverable on LinkedIn and you've shared your email addresses with us. For those who aren't familiar with Float, we are also on LinkedIn. You can find us at float.com. I'm also there under Siobhan Hayes. And if you have any feedback on this session, we'd love to hear it, marketing@float.com. Finally, we will be sending a copy of this recording to everyone within 48 hours of this session. And something that we didn't have time for is I wanted to end on a hot take from Jacquie and Justin, but we've run out of time. So I'm actually going to ask you both to send that to me directly, and we're going to include it in the email that we circulate. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, our audience as well, for handing in their questions and helping us curate this session. Until next time, bye for now.